Hi! Real, live, human beings. Oh my goodness! I think I promised that I wouldn't go around and hug each of you or just touch you to know that you're there, but know that in the back of my mind, I am doing that to all of you right now. So it is great to see so many of you in person. Welcome to Sense of Place Season 12. My name is Sarah Fox. I'm the host and curator of Sense of Place. I'm obviously very excited to have you guys here. This is why I took this job, was so that I could be around real life people. So the last 2 years have been quite ironic for me. My daughter reminded me this morning that it was almost exactly 2 years ago that we all descended into quarantine. And I have to say, I know a lot of you out here, and you guys know me, being told, understandably, that I needed to stay away from all people and just hang out with my family, who I love, but basically to stay away from strangers was a real Achilles heel for me. And I can tell you, I went to some real deep, dark places in that time. I started fantasizing about hugging strangers. We were in a place where, fortunately, groceries could be delivered, and I remember the person coming to the porch, and I would just sort of stand at the window wistfully, wanting so badly to just like open it and ask them how their day was going and what their life was like. So seeing you guys here tonight has made my dream come true, because during that time, I know this is like super dorky, but during that time, one of the things I kept thinking about was that someday we will be back to normal, or at least normal enough, that once again we will be able to gather together and do exactly what we're doing tonight. And I thought about standing here on this stage and looking out at all of you and knowing that we were going to do the thing that Sense of Place was always meant to do, which was to use this place as a way to bring together community and people. So thank you. You guys are making my dreams come true already. We've done it. My other dream is to get this guy to Hood River. And I can tell you that 2 years ago, when I took the job, Les Zites was at the top of my list of people I wanted to woo to come to Sense of Place. And he agreed. I don't think he had a choice. I think if he said no, that I would continue to woo. So he fortunately said yes that first year. COVID hit, and he has been very graciously waiting in the wings for 2 years until we could have him back in person. So it's definitely going to be worth the wait. I'll get to Les in a second, but I'm really excited about what we're going to hear from him tonight. So welcome to the Columbia Center for the Arts here in Hood River, Oregon. For those of you who are new to Sense of Place, we have been at this for 12 years. And in that time, we have had nearly 70 lectures with even more than that number of speakers on a huge variety of topics. Just this season alone, I don't know if you've been able to tune in, but just this season alone, we have talked about wild mushrooms. We have talked about wolverines. We have learned why the community health worker history here in the Gorge is so pertinent and connects to that history globally. We have learned about debris slides, which I can tell you, you may think, who cares about debris slides? But if you drive on Highway 14 and you drive on Highway 84, you better know about debris slides. So we got to learn about that. We got to learn about what bee likes to pollinate blueberries, and we learned how we could possibly have 500 native bees here in the Pacific Northwest. So that's just this year. Let's see. So this, to me, is part of what makes Sense of Place so important, is that once a month, from October through April, especially in those deep, dark winter nights, we have an excuse to come together, hear from someone who we may not usually get to hear from, and learn about something we may not usually get to learn about. And to me, that is what it's all about. And that's what makes Sense of Place so important and so valuable. Part of the way we're trying to extend what we learn is we've created a Sense of Place archive. And so over the past 2 seasons, we've been recording the lectures, putting them online, just like that. And so anyone, anywhere, at any time can go and check out what's been said. And to me, this is a great repository of knowledge that is going to live on forever online. And which means that this spring, when you think, oh my gosh, what's the one kind of native bee that goes and likes the blueberries? Or, okay, I'm going on a hike. Now, what is that wolverine? Where do they go? Or what does the Cascades, red fox scat look like? You can go tune in and find out. If you want to go find the right mushrooms in the right place, all that information is still there. So that, to me, is very awesome, is that what happens here tonight is not staying here tonight, okay? The other thing that is new, I don't know if you guys were aware of this, but you are all part of the world premiere of Sense of Place live stream. It's happening right now. Yeah, I hope you guys all signed your release forms. You guys? Hidden in the corner, we have Jeff. In another corner, we have another camera. And tonight we are, for the very first time, presenting in a hybrid format for a variety of reasons that I think are really important, which means we have all of you here in the theater, but we have a whole bunch of people tuning in from home. And we learned in the past 2 years that option is really important because folks can't always get to the theater. They can't always come out on a Wednesday night. We also have folks right now who that's just not safe for them. It's just not possible. And we also found that we had people outside of the gorge who wanted to know what we were doing. And so this way we get to serve you here and them on the live stream. And it's awesome to be having this hybrid model. It takes a lot more work. It's going to take more funding. But that is why I want to point you to these people right here. Some of you who I know are in the audience. These folks, I'll tell you, many of these people have been with us since day one. And it is absolutely no exaggeration for a program this small to say that without them, Sense of Place will not exist. And the fact that so many of these folks, particularly in 2 really tough years, said, we will support you again. We know you're trying to figure this out. These folks mean a lot to me, and they should mean a lot to you because the return on investment is not money for them. I can guarantee you the return on investment is that they're helping make this community strong. So if you see these people out and about, or you're in their coffee shop, or you see them somewhere, tell them thanks, because they really are doing something for all of you and all of us, and that means a lot. Thank you, yeah. If you're coming in, if you don't mind closing the door, that would be really awesome. Thank you. That's community, you guys, right there. Do you see that? All right. The one last really important piece to the Sense of Peace puzzle is Mount Adams Institute. So 2 years ago, we were very fortunate to be able to join the Mount Adams Institute, which is a local, long-running nonprofit. We are one of their programs now, although we are not the only one. They have a number of fantastic programs that if you haven't checked out, you should. They carry the same ethic that we do, which is how can we figure out how to connect all sorts of different people to place in whatever way works for them. So if you haven't, check out Mount Adams Institute. They're a fantastic partner. There are a number of staff members here tonight who volunteered their time. So very good folks, local organization. Okay, that is enough of the backstory here. A couple nuts and bolts. If you haven't already, silence your cell phone. Everything you want to hear is going to be said here tonight, so you don't need it on. Following the lecture, we will have a Q&A, and we're not on Zoom, so that means you're actually going to have to raise your hand with a question. You can't type it into the box, but I will come around and do my best to get as many questions in as we can afterwards. It's often one of the most entertaining parts, although with Les, who knows. So be ready for that. If you're listening and a question comes up, stick it in the back of your mind, and we'll have some time for that at the end. And now, I want to give a little background on this guy here. So I have a feeling a lot of you are here because you saw Netflix Wild Wild Country documentary. And if you were paying attention, it was a good documentary, that's right. You might recognize tonight's speaker, Les Zites. But I gotta tell you, long before Netflix got on the Rajneesh train, Les Zites was hired by the Oregonian to co-write an investigative story, 20 parts on the Rajneeshees in Oregon. And this is in real time. depending on how old you are, you actually remember that report, or depending on how much you like to go down wormholes after a documentary, you probably discovered it. But tonight, we're going to hear some of what that experience was like for Les. But before I invite you officially on stage to share some of that, I get to brag about him a little bit. Les is a 2-time Pulitzer finalist. He's a 5-time winner of the Oregon Bruce Baer Award, which is our top honor for investigative reporting. In 2016, he was awarded the highest honor for career achievement from the Oregon Newspapers Publishers Association. I can't say for sure, but I think Les actually filed his first story while he was still in utero. So he's pretty much been, we were talking earlier, he has investigative journalism in his blood, something that I would be horrible at. He is now the CEO and editor of the Salem Reporter, among many things. It's a digital news service that he co-founded in 2018. He is a born and raised Oregonian who lives on a remote ranch out in Grant County. So help me be loud and welcome Les Zites to Sense of Place Season 12.
August, fairly standard, fairly ordinary in Central Oregon. But for county commissioners from Wasco County, this was no ordinary day. They had driven 100 miles across the county, down a canyon, to a place where they met with some unusual constituents, the Rajneeshees. They were there to check on land use issues and planning issues and talk with the leaders of this unusual sect that had moved into Oregon. They went to leave and go back to the office, and they discovered they had a flat tire. As the Rajneeshees helpfully changed the tire, a woman walked up to them with a tray holding glasses of cold ice water. The men took the water and gulped it down thankfully. The tire was fixed, and they went on their way. Within days, one of those county commissioners lay in a hospital in the Dalles, close to death. Another commissioner who had taken off to his mountain cabin in Metolius lay in awful pain in a bed, hurting so bad that he couldn't call for help. They had been poisoned. Now, the idea of crippling or even killing public officials who are doing their job would leave most of us aghast. But for the folks at Rajneeshpuram, for a select group, this was just part of the playbook, poisoned water, another move to try and keep power, expand power, and protect what they thought they were building in the heart of Oregon. Those were dark days for Oregon in the mid-1980s. The religious sect at first amused Oregonians, and then they alarmed us. They seemed unstoppable. They had seemingly endless sources of cash. They were bringing in followers literally from around the world in a non-stop commute to Rajneeshpuram. And they came to sit at the feet of their one master, the Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. This was a remarkable time in Oregon history. And to this day, I still marvel at what happened nearly 40 years ago. In Oregon, we were tested in that time as we had never been tested before. Our laws were tested. Our tolerance was tested, and indeed our government was tested. Today, here in Oregon and across the United States, we again are being tested. But this time our tolerance is not being tested by a sect, but by politics. Our laws are being tested not by foreign criminals, but by US citizens. And our government is not being tested by a sex-preaching guru, but autocrats. The question I want you to keep in your mind as I go through this evening is what is the lessons from what happened in Oregon in the 1980s can we draw that we might apply to what's happening to all of us in this country in this time. Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh was a native of India. He grew up in an impoverished small village in the heart of India, no paved streets, no running water. I know, I went and tracked down his hometown. He was a college professor in philosophy, but he soon discovered that lecturing to Westerners who were seeking something new, something fresh, something to relieve the angst of the Vietnam War and of the crises of the time, who sought the freedom that he gave them to practice tantric sex and to abandon the norms of social relationships. And they came by the dozens, and by the hundreds, and by the thousands. And they brought to India, a conservative country, a lifestyle that soon shocked the people of India. The government of India reacted to this and started putting pressure on the Bhagwan and his growing entourage to either shut down or leave. That's when Oregon came into play. Now, the Rajneeshees didn't Google Oregon and find that we were a state that loved religious sects. What brought them to Oregon and to the Big Muddy Ranch in 1981 was one simple thing, a for sale sign. They had been looking literally all over the country for a large tract of land far from a major city where they could set up their new global headquarters. For them, at that time, Oregon was just a place on the map. They didn't have any connection to our state. They didn't have any connection to our people. They didn't have any connection to our politicians. And that became very apparent when the Guru's chief secretary, Ma Anand Sheila Silverman, friendly, sharp-witted, engaging, brought a handful of the followers to the Madras area to close the deal for the ranch, and then started the fable that they were coming just to restore the ranch to its agricultural uses. Sheila described the group as simple farmers. They were far from that. But when they bought the ranch, Sheila and her advisors made a crucial mistake that would play out in the coming years. They did not understand that in Oregon, we had sharp limits on what you could do with land, particularly in rural areas, particularly with farmland. Sheila and her entourage bought the 64,000 Big Muddy Ranch, thinking that they were simply going to plop down a global enterprise out in the middle of nowhere. So they bought the ranch and started moving people in. They started building their commune. They built roads. They put in houses. They put in A-frames. They put in a massive lecture hall so they could daily sit at the feet of the guru and listen to him speak on and on about anything and everything. They even put in a disco. They had shop buildings that will be the envy of any rancher in Oregon even today. They had money, they had purpose, and they were intent on executing on both of those. They did farm. They attracted some of the smartest people on the globe to this enterprise. Engineers, doctors, college professors, people who were all shared one thing. They were seeking. Many of them, I don't think, really knew what they were seeking. They were just after something. So you have doctors who are out planting radishes. You have engineers who are washing carrots in the sheds. Then the pattern of life developed. They would stop each day, settle together, and meditate. Same time, same place every day. Now, this had a personal benefit to them, but it also had a benefit to the organization. It was one more way, one step to help pull the people together in a combine that would become critical to what happened in the years ahead. They would have workshops. They would teach you to dance. They would teach you to play music. It was like utopia for some folks. And it was a shared experience. There was very little privacy at the ranch. Your meals were in giant communal halls, eating some of the food that you grew, but much more that was trucked in day by day down a long, dusty, windy canyon road. They would have celebrations to celebrate what they were doing, how they were relieving themselves of their stresses, of their views of life, and adopting a new way of life. All of this was designed to create a group dynamic, to make everybody feel of one. But while they're creating the group dynamic, they also created something else. Out in the middle of nowhere, they created a city, Rajneeshpuram. They petitioned, they had a vote. The vote was surprisingly unanimous to create the city. They elected a mayor, a city council, just as you do here in Hood River. They had a city attorney. They established a city hall. In other words, they took upon themselves the powers of government. They created a police force. The police force folks went to the police academies alongside officers from Bend, from the Dalles, from Ashland, got the same training, the same certification, and the same authority to arrest and charge. All this took people, and month by month, the population at the ranch grew, the amount of housing grew, the traffic in and out of the ranch and through Portland and through Madras grew, and Oregon became restive because this was something well beyond an amusing group of people dressed in red living on a communal farm. The governor at the time was Vicatia, a very widely well-respected Republican. He was no firebrand. He was just a decent gentleman. And he told Oregon at the time, as people started getting a little anxious and in some instances actually angry about what was happening, and he told the state this: regardless of the religious beliefs or practices of this group, they are entitled to every right afforded under our Constitution. Sheila took those words to heart, and she stretched those rights to the limit. She was the face of the commune, sometimes smiling, sometimes friendly, sometimes angry, but always in control. She had a ring of accomplices that she pulled around herself, and it became sort of this internal council that knew more about what was really the truth of what was happening at the ranch than anyone who was driving a road grader or planting carrots knew. She would hold these massive group meetings and be the voice of the guru, because there were times when the guru would sit in his mobile home at the ranch and would stay out of sight for days and sometimes weeks. And Sheila would become the messenger. And she spoke for him and on his behalf, and the followers to a person were to consider Sheila as the stand-in for the guru. What she said went without question. Part of this idea of keeping the folks focused on internal cohesiveness and being bonded together was a daily ritual, the drive-by. By the time this all fell apart, the Bhagwan had a count of 93 Rolls Royces, all given to him as gifts by wealthy sannyasins or funded by overseas trips to European acolytes who would write checks to buy the next Rolls Royce. And the Bhagwan would get in his Rolls Royce and go on a 2 or 3 mile drive through the ranch. The entire ranch operation would come to a stop, and people would line the roads. They had bought rose petals, they chanted, they sang, they adulated as he drove by at a very, very slow pace. And there were times when Sheila was right there beside him, walking along with the Rolls Royce. Again, the image is powerful. Sheila and the Bhagwan are one. What he says, she says. There's no separation. As all this began to develop and the publicity began to flow and the number of Rajneeshees flowing through Oregon increased and the tensions started to increase, at the Oregonian, where I worked as an investigative reporter at that time, we asked ourselves sort of a pretty basic question. Who are these people? Because we really didn't know. We had some vague idea that they had come from India, and they had a very, very potent public relations operation at the ranch, very sophisticated, very smart PR agents that could spin an amazingly believable story. But the Oregonian put together a team, myself, my reporting partner at that time, Jim Long, and an assistant city editor, Scott McAllister, who now happens to be my wife, to answer that question about who these people were. We want to know, well, who was Sheila? Where did she come from? Who was the Bhagwan? What was his background? How did he wind up on a ranch in Oregon from a small village in India? And where was the money coming from? As part of that, I spent a month in India. It was one of the most remarkable reporting assignments I've had in my entire career, and I've had plenty of pretty fascinating assignments in time. But I spent time talking to followers in what was then Bombay. I rode with a photographer across the plains of India in the middle of the night in a taxi, quote unquote taxi. It's a guy that simply had a car with a key that would work, to go to the village where I sat down with the 2 uncles of the guru. And they ran a cloth store in this little bitty village, Kuchwada. And I remember sitting there with these 2 uncles, and they were fascinated that a Westerner had come to their village, number 1. Number 2, they were fascinated that I had seen Bhagwan. And so as I'm talking to these 2 uncles, they have a small shop. It's an open front store. And I looked up at one point, and there were all of these little faces. The people of the village, the word had spread that someone from Oregon was there, and it was a wall of faces listening in on the interview. We worked for 18 months on this investigation. My partner, Jim Long, spent 2 months traveling throughout Europe, where the Rajneeshees had extensive operations, primarily designed to pull money into the global headquarters in Oregon. But as we're doing that investigation, back at the ranch, the daily lectures continued. Sheila began getting more and more aggressive, abusive, rude, and even crude in her public commentary. To her, any publicity was good publicity, and to her, being offensive to the governor, to the attorney general, to the United States attorney, just showed the people back at the ranch that Sheila was watching out for them, and so you better watch out for her. But the pressures were building. They were building from the inside and from the outside. And there would be a point where those 2 pressures would converge in a way that would bring the entire operation to collapse. Inside, Sheila and her a dozen of her closest aides sensed that they were losing control. The followers themselves, the sannyasins, as they were called at the ranch, the ones with the malas hanging from their neck with a picture of Bhagwan, started questioning what they were seeing and what they were hearing. The anger, the vitriol that was coming from the top was at complete odds with the peace and love that they were hearing as the message of their guru. Sheila was very, very effective at maintaining control, and one of her primary tools, inside and outside, was fear. She used fear to try and unify the sannyasins against the outside world, to portray that those of us in Oregon were now their enemies, that we were there to destroy what they were working so hard to build. And you can imagine the impact of that kind of a message on someone who has given up everything, given up families, given up fortunes, given up careers, in a pursuit of an ideal lifestyle, to be told that that lifestyle is threatened by one thing, and that is the people of Oregon. But that wasn't enough for Sheila. She created an internal security force. These folks were well armed. They trained relentlessly. The explanation was, this is to defend the ranch against all enemies. In fact, what it was intended to do was to create another layer of intimidation for those who were simply trying to grow the carrots. They undertook, at Sheila's direction, the largest wiretapping operation ever in American history. They bugged public telephones at the ranch. They bugged apartments. They bugged every single room in the hotel where the parents, the sannyasins, would come to stay to find out what their children were doing. They bugged the guru's own home. They put a mic in his throne-like chair in his home where he would sit for hours meditating. And when he asked about it, there was a button on the arm, and he asked about that, and they told him that was a panic button, and not to touch it unless there was an emergency. And in fact, it was a microphone. But the inside threats only grew. And Sheila was the type of person who liked to meet force with force and to excel and exceed any force that you might bring against her. Two people were particularly critical to her to control. One was Mayoga Vivek, who was the longtime companion of the guru, who prepared his meals, took care of his clothes, a quiet young woman from England. The other was a doctor, George Meredith, known at the ranch as Devaraj. Sheila and her council were concerned that they were telling the guru what Sheila was doing on the outside that was starting to damage the communal aspirations of those living on the ranch. The response by Sheila and her henchmen was to plan a couple of murders. For Vivek, two of Sheila's lieutenants prepared to sneak into Vivek's own home at night, chloroform her, and then inject her with a fatal concoction of drugs. They wanted to chloroform her to keep her from struggling against the injection. But just in case she fought, the primary assailant shaved her fingernails down. Why? Because if Vivek struggled and there was a fight, there would be no physical evidence left on her fingernails. That's how thorough and careful these people were. They took their chloroform, they took their poison concoction, went to her home, went to the back door, and that's when they discovered they had stolen the wrong key to her home. That's what saved Vivek. Devaraj wasn't quite so lucky. When the other top leaders in the commune, went onto a dance floor one night. And this was a big, big dance floor you've seen. I mean, hundreds of people in throes with the music and swaying and dancing and people moving around. And she had a ring on. And the ring had a small needle in it. And that needle contained poison. And she tracked down Deveraj with all the noise and all the jostling around and stuck that needle into his butt. And he went into convulsions. And Shanti Bhadra, who was the assailant, feigned great concern. Oh, well, what's wrong, Deveraj? What, you don't look so well. Deveraj knew right away what had happened. They took him to a hospital, and he survived, but just barely. This is one of their own. This is one of the Guru's longest associates from his days in India, and they had tried to kill him. Outside, pressures were mounting as well. The federal authorities, the Immigration Service, was involved in a massive investigation into visa fraud. Again, many of these sannyasins had come into the United States from foreign countries, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, England, Japan. And they had arranged phony marriages so that these folks could stay in well in excess of what visas normally would permit. State authorities were investigating them for endless land use violations. They were putting up A-frame houses without permits or the proper permits. They were doing electrical wiring for hundreds of tents without getting any sort of the inspection that you or I would have to get if we simply wanted to rewire our garage. And the press. By this time, and now we're talking about, early 1985, our investigation was well underway. The Rajneeshees were well aware that the Oregonian was involved in this investigation. We had made trips down to the ranch. We had stayed at the hotel. We had stayed at the A-frames. We had gone to City Hall. We had gone through city records, asking questions and not getting very good answers. The mayor of Rajneeshpuram went by the name of KD. He was a former youth counselor from Los Angeles who'd been elected mayor, quote unquote, of Rajneeshpuram. He asked for a tour of the newsroom of the Oregonian as part of just getting acquainted. His real purpose, and he got his tour, his real purpose was to get into the newsroom and see where my team was based. He took that information back to Sheila and her henchmen, and they developed an elaborate scheme where they had two sannyasins steal the cleaning garb used by the company that cleaned the Oregonian's building. And they were going to come into the Oregonian, get to our work area, and essentially destroy our computers, thinking that would stop our work. They got their cleaning gear, they got into the building, and just as they were to get out on the fourth floor where our offices were, a really tough nighttime supervisor of the cleaning crew stopped them. Said, what are you doing here? Because she didn't recognize them. And oh, well, we were supposed to be in another building, and they aborted the mission. But that was kids' play compared to what happened in the coming months over here in the gorge and at the ranch. They devised a variety of schemes to try to impair and impinge and damage the governments in the Dalles, in Wasco County, and of the public officials. One scheme they came up with was to poison the water for the entire city of the Dalles. But they couldn't figure out how to get into the city's water tank. Years before 9/11 and Al-Qaeda flying jets into those towers, the Rajneeshees talked about flying a bomb-laden plane into the courthouse in the Dalles. One of the major thorns in their side was Dan DeRoe, who was then the planning director for Wasco County and responsible for enforcing the land use laws. They had made his life miserable, and he felt so threatened by their continued presence in his office and their insistent demands that he sent his kids out of town for the duration until he thought the danger would pass. But heckling and harassing Dan wasn't enough for Sheila and her troop. So they concocted yet another scheme. This time, an undercover team based in Portland drove down the gorge to the Dalles one night and pried open a window to get into the county planning office with the intent of burning it to the ground. Their thinking, if the files didn't exist, they couldn't enforce the law. The two sannyasis got in. They set up an arrangement of candles that were set on top of diesel-soaked cardboard. So when the idea was that as the candles burned down, they would ignite the diesel would then burn the building. But as with so many of these Rajneeshi escapades, as it were, or these conspiracies, they always made a fatal mistake. And they did this time as well. They closed the window they had opened when they left. What that meant is that those candles didn't have sufficient oxygen to burn. Now, the fire did get started, but it wasn't much of a fire, and a passerby caught it very quickly, and the fire was put out before there was much damage. Then, one of the Wasco County commissioners went to Portland and was going to be hospitalized for ear surgery. The Rajneeshis found out about this. They dispatched a sannyasin to find this commissioner in his hospital room and inject poison into his IV. The would-be assassin, taken by a team to Portland, to the hospital, got into the hospital, had a syringe with that poison concoction, only to discover that the commissioner had been moved to another room that they couldn't access. Then the idea became, and it was the guru's idea, as the anger built among the leadership and Bhagwan himself was getting angry at Oregon's treatment of his people, that he wasn't satisfied with having his own city. He wanted to have his own county. And the way you would do that is to get sannyasins elected to the county commission in Wasco County. How do you do that? Two ways. You pump up the voter rolls so that your followers, and there were thousands of them, could overtake the regular voting population. But then just to make sure, for election day, you would not only have your sannyasins, but you would find some way to make the regular voters fail to go to the polls. So the first part of this of beefing up the population was that the sannyasis began bringing in busloads of homeless people from every major city in America. Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Seattle, Chicago. These are people who were not only homeless, they were mentally unstable, they were criminals, they were lost souls who suddenly find themselves plopped into the middle of a commune in a place they've never heard of, and they're told two things. You need to register to vote, and you have to stay in this compound. And essentially they became prisoners of the Rajneeshis. Later on, when this all fell apart, the Rajneeshees, who professed great love, and this was just a demonstration of their compassion for the downtrodden in America, these cynical people put them back on buses and simply started dumping them, kicking them off the buses in Madras, in Bend, in Portland. And you can imagine, particularly a town like Madras, all of a sudden overrun with scores of homeless people who have no money, no place to go, and little idea where they are. They weren't done with the Dalles in Wasco County yet. Manan Puja was a registered nurse. She ran the medical operation, quote unquote, medical operation at the ranch. She had a laboratory established and hidden up a canyon, many canyons on Big Muddy Ranch, but they had established a medical laboratory where she was experimenting with viruses and salmonella. They decided that the salmonella would be the most effective poison to apply. So they ran some experiments. The mayor, KD, the gentleman from Los Angeles who toured the Oregonian, he took a vial of salmonella to the courthouse in the Dalles and started spreading it on doorknobs for ordinary people to encounter. A young woman took a vial to a public rally, an indoor rally, went and sat down next to an elderly gentleman, feigned great politeness, and turned to introduce herself and shake the gentleman's hand. She had smeared a salmonella on her hand. Sheila didn't want to be left out, so she went with a group, and they went parked outside of a grocery store, and Sheila turned to them and said, "Let's have some fun." And they went into that grocery store and sprinkled salmonella on the produce. But it didn't have the impact they were looking for. They didn't get reports of people getting sick. There was no indication that these minor measures were very effective. It was time to step it up. This is when the idea came in to poison salad bars. In a matter of days, sannyasins spread throughout the Dalles, in plain clothing, of course, undercover as it were, with vials of salmonella, and went into restaurants where local people dined, where travelers came off the freeway to dine, thinking nothing more than they're just getting another meal on another day. But the sannyasins sprinkled salmonella on one salad bar, 2 salad bars, 3 salad bars. By the time they were done, they had spread their poison on 10 salad bars. Puja, the nurse, she helped. She was with an accomplice, and they had the audacity to go into a restaurant, sit down, and have lunch. She went and sprinkled the salmonella on the salad bar and went back to her table and finished her lunch as if nothing extraordinary was happening. But indeed it was. There was a trickle, and then more and more people were showing up at hospitals and medical clinics deathly ill. By the time their work had taken hold, more than 700 people would come down with salmonella poisoning. And authorities believe that figure is quite low because, again, this is on Interstate 84. People stop, get a lunch, they get in a car, they drive to Pasco, they drive to Boise, they drive to Wenatchee, and by the time they get home and they get sick, there was no easy way to track what had happened. There were whispers at the time, this has got to be the Rajneeshees. And it was an incredibly intense investigation by public health authorities. And to their everlasting embarrassment, after an extensive investigation, at that time, they concluded that at the same time in 10 different restaurants, employees had simply failed to wash their hands after using the bathroom. Sheila knew better. Pooja knew better. A dozen of the Rajneeshees knew damn well what the real truth was. But Sheila, always after power, thought she was now in a position to make a deal with the state of Oregon. She's got the homeless. She's threatening to dump them in the streets. She's got thousands of sannyasins coming in for their annual Summer World Festival, which is no more than a quick way to fleece sannyasins of even more money. And she wanted to have a face-to-face meeting with Vic Atiyeh. Well, Governor Atiyeh was a pretty shrewd, smart man. And he knew that that was a non-starter. But he dispatched his chief of staff to have a secret meeting with Sheila, to hear her out. Chief of staff was Jerry Thompson, former insurance company executive, and one very tough woman in her own right. They met in the basement of a state office building in Portland. Conversation started off civil enough and legitimate enough, and then Sheila became Sheila. She started being pushy, started getting demanding, and then she just got rude. Jerry Thompson finally slammed her hand on the table and said, "That's it, meeting over. No more deal." That's when the assassinations turned from being inside to outside. They put together a list of enemies who were particularly troublesome to the sect, and to the sect's leadership in particular. And they marked them for assassination. Number one on the list was Charles Turner, United States Attorney for Oregon. He was supervising the immigration investigations, and the talk was that he was fairly close to indicting a number of the sannyasins and the guru himself for federal immigration crimes. He had to go, Sheila decided. So one team scouted the country and bought guns that couldn't be traced back to the Rajneeshees. Other teams shadowed Turner. He lived out in the country outside of Portland. They found where he lived. They shadowed him to his home. They shadowed him to work. They marked where he parked, and they worked on plans. They practiced plans. They practiced and considered feigning that they had a flat tire not far from his home, knowing that Charles Turner, being a civil man that he would stop and offer to help. And that's when they would kill him. It didn't happen. Number two on the list was Dave Frohnmeyer, the Attorney General for the state of Oregon. The Attorney General had launched very aggressive legal actions against the sect for creating the city. The basic premise was that the Constitution requires a separation of church and state, and you cannot have church running a government. And Mr. Frohnmeyer and his team went up against a very able team of lawyers for the Rajneeshees. They had their own law clinic down there at the Big Muddy. These were not stupid people, folks. These were very smart lawyers, very skilled lawyers, and battled Dave and his team week after week, month after month, ruling after ruling. But the state of Oregon was prevailing. So Dave Frohnmeyer was number two on the list. The Attorney General lived in Eugene at the time, and Rajneeshees wanted to make sure they knew where he lived so they could figure out an assassination plan. So they had one of them dress in regular garb, pose as a Bible salesman, to go to the house they believed was Frohnmeyer's, just to verify that that's where he lived. And number three on the list was me. In the team of reporters working on this, I had sort of developed the bad guy persona. Well, maybe I didn't develop it, maybe I've always had it. But my partner, Jim Long, is a very genial, very friendly sort, just like a big friendly St. Bernard. And you would tell him anything because he's just so friendly. And me, I'm going to be chewing on your ankles until you tell me the truth. They targeted me for assassination. But it came to an end very quickly because the effort to assassinate Turner failed. And the people who were assigned to that assassination team could no longer take it. They snapped. They told Sheila, there will be no more killing. We will not kill anybody. By that time, the federal authorities were well into their immigration investigation. The lawyers for the guru learned that he was about to be indicted on federal charges, which would put him in handcuffs before a federal judge. But instead, one night, he and a small entourage got onto a private jet and made a run for it. They were headed for the Bahamas. But federal officials tracked that plane every single mile across the United States. When it stopped to refuel in North Carolina before leaving American airspace, the federal authorities put the handcuffs on him. In that private jet, they found boxes of jewelry, they found cash, they found weapons. Meantime, Sheila fled the ranch as well and took with her a number of the very top leaders. She ended up in a small village in Germany, seemingly beyond the powers of extradition. But she too was eventually caught, arrested, and brought back to the United States. As this was going on, the ranch was being dismantled piece by piece. Sannyasins finally saw the truth because the Bhagwan, the guru, started holding public sessions and describing to astonished listeners, and this included the sannyasins and the press that was invited, as he started to unspool what had been happening with Sheila. And it was just day after day, disclosure after disclosure, that just left these people crushed in tears, utopia vaporized before their eyes, and they left. The ranch went into bankruptcy, the assets were sold. An auto dealer from Texas showed up and bought those 93 Rolls Royces, every last one of them, and trucked them back to Texas. The A-frames they had used both for guests and for their own housing were sold off. A little credit union in John Day held title to about a half a dozen and took them back. And they sat along Highway 26 for years. Nobody wanted them. So the ranch emptied out. The dream was gone. The experiment was over. The guru pleaded guilty, was ejected from the country, and died in 1990. Little town of Antelope, about 15 miles outside of Rajneeshpuram. The Rajneeshees had taken over this town like they were planning to take over Wasco County. They had moved into this little bitty town that had no more than 50 people, and most of them probably no younger than 80. And the Rajneeshees invaded this little town and renamed it. Took over the school, took over the council. With the ranches collapsed, it was a proud day when the name Antelope was restored to the community. And the ranch itself saw a new life as a young life encampment. And I went down there many, many years later looking for any sign of the Rajneeshees. And I had been down there many, many times before. And I knew what to look for and where to look. And it was astonishing to me that a major global enterprise could so cleanly be wiped off the face of the earth. I found one sign and one label on a kitchen hood that said property of Rajneeshpuram. That was it. Sheila was sentenced to federal prison, served no more than 2 years. Pooja, the nurse, served time. in federal prison. In fact, they say shared cells in a prison in California. Sheila wound up in Switzerland, of all things, running group care homes, taking care of people. Pooja married a doctor and lives in Hawaii, the last that I knew. But as I've thought about this story, and I've thought about Rajneeshpuram and the Rajneeshees and the sannyasins many, many, many times over the years, I've thought, what are the lessons? And as I think tonight about what's going on in our country, I reflect on the echoes. At that time, the lessons were this, that our laws, and the laws in Oregon in particular, work. They may not work fast as people might want. They may not always be as cleanly executed laws, but they do work. They're laws for us all. We were a tolerant state. As a state, as a people, we did not wish these people any ill will. You know, there were a few among us, of course, as you have in any crowd, knuckleheads who thought this was an occasion to really stir up trouble. But again, as a people, as a tolerant state, we were willing to let them do what they wanted to do as long as they abided by the law and were civil. We wished them no harm, but they delivered plenty. So where are we today when you think about this? Well, we can discuss this quite a bit tonight, but here's where I come down. That as a society, as a people, as a state, we do have to defend what we have. But we don't defend it with force. We defend it with principle, and we defend it with law. And today, our country faces enormous challenges. We see a country deeply divided, a country angry with each other. But there's a lesson to be drawn from the time of the sannyasins and the guru. In my mind, it is this. That yes, we have challenges, but we have to face those challenges with character, with patience, with faith. We have to have a belief that justice and right will prevail. That's not only a hope, it is something we must find a way to accomplish so that the United States can again be one country with one people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Les. Joe, if you don't mind, excuse me, bringing up the house lights just a little bit so I can see everybody. While you guys think, if you have questions, I'm going to ask mine since I have the microphone. I'm curious, if you were to reflect on, you mentioned early on sort of the state of the world and what they were coming off of as far as, you got that, the Vietnam War. If you were to look at the characteristics of the people and the needs that they were expressing that brought them here in the first place into the Bhagwan, what sort of characteristics and needs were showing up in people that they were hoping to fulfill by coming here?
That's a good question.
Well, thank you.
Next. Look, you know, we spent, as reporters, we spent a lot of time with what you would consider to be the ordinary sannyasins. And then when followers had become disaffected, we would find them in New Mexico and Texas and California and spend a great deal of time trying to get at that very question. And there is no cookie cutter answer. Everybody was seeking something to bring satisfaction to their lives. You know, their career as a doctor didn't provide the satisfaction that they were seeking. And for some, organized religion wasn't providing the spiritual relief that they were looking for. So, frankly, I don't spend much time psychoanalyzing those because that's a disservice to what was going on. All I know is that they were seeking, and they were all seeking individually.
Was it primarily people who you would categorize as coming from Western countries?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Come on, you guys. Here's your chance. All right. And if you can speak in the mic, that helps us for the live stream be able to have the folks at home hear your question.
Just curious in what you think would have happened if the law hadn't prevailed and they'd been allowed to continue on the same trajectory that they were on. What do you think would have happened?
I don't like to think about that. I mean, look, I've investigated, drug cartels and biker gangs and the legislature. Speaking of dangerous organizations, but I will tell you, nobody scares me as much as Sheila and the people that were around her for just, in my view, the pure evil. Pure evil. This wasn't a game for her in some ways. And so if they had succeeded in taking over Wasco County, if they had been a little more, shown a little more finesse in how they did that and not be so brash about it, if they had seized control of Wasco County, then I think the state would have descended into look, enough's enough. And I hate to think about what sort of violence, what sort of response there would have been to that. I don't know if that answers your question.
They had an army there, basically, right?
Yes, they were very well armed. They had some of the best weaponry, rifles, long guns, and pistols, and that sort of any paramilitary organization, and could get more.
Thank a public servant. Boy.
Thank you. I'm really curious about your trip to India, and when you said you met with the uncles, what did they think of what was happening? Did he have this strong following at that point in India? And did you get a sense that they thought he was a guru? What did you learn on your travels? Thank you.
Well, the folks in his birth village of Kuchwada, where the two uncles were, and one of my favorite memories of going to this little village is that I met the uncles, and the mayor showed up in his Honda 150 and insisted on taking me and the photographer to his home for tea. Well, a Honda 150 is like this, it holds one person, and we got 3 people on this thing going through these dusty streets. The uncles, the people in that village, only had a bare concept that he was in the West and in America, but they had no idea the scale or scope of what he was doing. In Jabalpur, where he was a college professor, I talked to people that he worked with at the college, and they were sort of amused. They said, yeah, that's him, he loves the limelight. And then his major installation in India was out in a city called Pune, outside of Bombay. And I spent a lot of time in Bombay and Pune, and tracked down people who were there from the beginning with him. And they were sorrowful because they believed in his message. And as with so many of these charismatic people, you can hear what you want from these messages and take what you want, and it resonates with you because it hits some paradigm of your own. But these folks were dismayed that he had left India, number one, and number two, what they were hearing back from America just was a juxtaposition they couldn't quite get their arms around. They were not proud of him. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, that'll be $5.
We're nonprofit here, Les.
Oh, yeah.
Hold on. I want to know who you are, because I have a feeling. Who are you?
My name's Aiden Zaitz.
Who's that guy?
My grandfather.
Grandson here, guys. All right.
So, when you first heard that the Rajneeshees,
Aren't you supposed to be in bed?
when you first heard that they had moved to Oregon, what were your first thoughts? Like,
Say that again?
what were your first thoughts when you heard that they had moved to Oregon and like what they were intending to do?
Well, like many people in Oregon, it was a curiosity. You know, it's not quite like Santa Claus moving to Oregon, but, you know, it's something like that. It was, in the early days, it was amusing. You know, they're all running this, what's with the red clothes and what's with the mala and who's this old bearded guy that's got their picture? You know, and they threw parties in Madras and they were nice to people and there was no reason to be very suspicious until they started bringing more and more people in.
Thank you, Aiden.
Good question. That was a great
Yeah, that was a
question.
good question. Yeah, I'm going to hand this up to you if you don't mind.
At what point did Sheila come into the picture? Was she with him in India still, or did she hook up with him later once he had already gathered quite a following? And were they in just a purely partnership, or because you mentioned he had a female partner? But
Companion,
what was?
yeah. Okay, so you asked 7 questions there. No,
Those are my favorite kind.
if I just say yes, does that answer it? Sheila grew up in the daughter of a wealthy merchant in a city called Baroda, about 200 miles north of what is now Mumbai. Sheila came to join the movement as a young woman, and at that time, the Bhagwan had a personal secretary, in essence, a chief of staff, an Indian native who'd been with him for years and years and years. And Sheila saw opportunity. She saw the money coming in with the Westerners. Sheila was profoundly determined to achieve wealth for the organization, if not for herself in some fashion, and to live a high life. And then she in a very cold and calculating way, which is the Sheila way, she managed to maneuver the original personal secretary out of the picture, take over the operation, and then engineer the move to the United States. Did that answer any of the 7 questions?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, hi. So Pune still exists, and there's still Osho centers around the U.S. And around a vast majority of the world. Do you still view any of those, in your opinion, as a threat, or do you think it was really solely centered around one person with malintent?
Well, that's a bit unfair. I mean, I haven't done any investigation of any of these centers. I don't frankly follow them. I will tell you this, that yeah, I recognize that a number of what I consider the true believers did return to Pune after the ranch collapsed and refashioned the organization. It still was worshipful of Rajneesh. Honestly, at this point, I have no reason to think that the operation in Pune or any of the outlets, and I believe for a long time there was one in Ashland, remains anything close to the kind of threat that we experienced at the Big Muddy.
Thank you. Yes, don't be shy, you guys. You got to get it up there. I know it's not Zoom.
No,
but
don't let him ask.
So this is a question and hopefully an invitation. Because of your involvement in covering the Malheur occupation, the question is whether or not you'll be invited back to talk about that. But do you see any parallels between what happened in Rajneeshpuram and the Malheur occupation out in Harney County?
Next question. I think there are some parallels to this extent, that what you saw at the refuge is really what you saw at the ranch. In other words, these folks, number one, gathered around a charismatic leader, and at the occupation you had Bundy, Ammon Bundy. You had people who coalesced around what they perceived as a common outside threat, right? They believed generally that they were on the right side of history and of justice and of the law, and that the rest of us who were concerned and attempting to address this occupation of the bird refuge seemed to just bind those people ever tighter together. The more the outside pressure grew, the more the presence of the federal authorities and the state police grew, the more it attracted supporters for those that were occupying. In my sense, and I spent a fair amount of time talking with Ammon Bundy and his brothers and those folks, it just seemed to weld them tighter together. And I think when you do that, the opportunity to act out, to take violent action as the answer, goes up. And you would know it better than I would if that was the case. But that was certainly my impression. So the parallels to me between the two are again, the power of creating an outside boogeyman, as it were, by leaders, and how that is used to forge a wall of support internal to the organization to maintain control of the people that you want to control. It's as much about control of the people on the inside of the fence as being against the people on the outside. Does that seem fairly true? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
So you spent a lot of time talking about Sheila, and you used the word evil, and we heard that she sort of manipulated her way into the organization. But you also mentioned that the Bhagwan's, the kernel of his philosophy was like peace and love. So I'm curious what your thought is. Without Sheila, would there have been this entire like evil scenario, or were the seeds already there and it would have happened anyways? Like, who do you think the real villain is?
Well, to be honest with you, that's a bit unresolved in my mind. I'll give you a bifurcated answer. In, I think it was 2010, I went to Switzerland and I spent 3 days with Sheila, which was a fascinating experience after I hadn't seen her since 1985. And I started preparing a 25-year retrospective for the Oregonian, and I tracked her down and I called her and said, hey, I'd like to come visit with you. And Sheila acted like we were long-lost friends. I said, hi, this is Les Zites calling from Oregon. She said, who? So Les Zites. Les! Like, you know, Uncle Harry had just called her. But I spent a lot of time talking with Sheila and talking about the guru, trying to tease out that answer. And she was very coy about it. But my final conclusion was that he was in charge and in control. And he was a partner in all of this. He was not sitting up in the canyon in his Lao Tzu retreat thinking great thoughts about humanity. He was as compulsive about power and accumulating wealth. Remember, he's the one that demanded those Rolls Royces. They just didn't materialize out of a catalog. He asked for them. He asked for $1 million watches to test Sheila, to test his devotees. So to answer your question, no, Sheila would not have done what she did without him, in my judgment. I could be wrong, but that's my judgment.
Les, one question. early on, my recollection was Sheila was somehow related personally to somebody in the New York Stock Exchange.
She married John Shelfer. One of her, she's had a number of husbands. John Shelfer was a fairly successful stock trader in New York. That she married him after her first husband died in New Jersey, and John, who became a sannyasi, was at the ranch and had a lot of the money. They eventually split. He moved down to the Bay Area, and in my 25-year retrospective, I did go down there and spent a couple of days with John, which was fascinating. What was also fascinating is that 2 or 3 of the lawyers who were involved, remember I talked about their own law clinic? 2 or 3 of the lawyers were down there and had formed a new law firm, and he invited them to come over to his house, and they came over, and it was polite for about a half hour. And then these lawyers really started ripping into me about how they still believed that Oregon was to blame for what had happened. And frankly, I sat there in sort of stunned silence, because I've been through this for decades and gone through records and tons of interviews. And to have these people sit there and start lecturing me about how Oregon had wrecked them was really dispiriting. Okay, one more question. I gotta go to bed.
Pressure's on. You got it?
Somebody else mentioned Osho. Was he also known as Osho?
Yeah, he changed his name to Osho
Afterwards.
after to try and wash off a little bit of the Oregon experience.
I've seen his YouTubes and things like that. So.
Okay, I have to ask one more question. I told you, I'm a one more question kind of person. Okay, so here's my question. You talked both about for the Malheur and then also for this idea of when you can have a common bad guy, a boogeyman, outsider, it's going to unite the thing. Okay, and so I am always struggling with when there is something that I disagree with or have a problem with, if I go at it as an attack, it often puts that wall up stronger. Mm-hmm. So what's the alternative method when there's something like this? How do you get that interaction or diffuse a situation perhaps like this or Malheur where you're not just making the wall go up? What's a different way of approaching the situation, particularly
well,
as
thanks
a world...
for coming tonight, folks. Look,
I know. I'm just curious.
Look, I'm not a scholar or an academic. I'm just a reporter out there sort of banging on these. Look, with the Malheur occupation, I mean, I spent a lot of time talking to Ammon Bundy, trying to understand okay, let's put the BS aside. What do you really want to accomplish here? And I think he just wanted the spotlight. He would say whatever it took to get the press back in there. So, I'm not smart enough to figure out how do we as a society deal with those sorts of individuals, and there's a lot of them in the country right now. But how do you mitigate that sort of contorted view? I guess bottom line, though, is that we can't ever quit trying.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I hope to see you next month. Thank you so much for coming to Sense of Place. Thank you, Les. I really appreciate it. Have a lovely night.